Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Wednesday, June 13th edition of the Cluster API Working Group breakout meeting from SIG Cluster Lifecycle. The first thing I put on the agenda today is just a brief recap from last week. We talked about cutting the first release of clusterctl, and we did that last Thursday, so right sort of the day after this meeting. We found a couple of bugs, and I cut another release on Monday of this week. So we have two releases. You can see a link to where those are in our GitHub repo. And you can see the release notes that I put together for those. If you have any suggestions about how to make better release notes, or if you want to follow up on the release process in general, there is an issue that was linked last week about the release process, and we should probably come back to that when Chris Nova is on the line, because I think she had some opinions about how we would cut releases. So I just wanted to give an FYI that we had cut a release. If people are interested in trying that out, that would be great. If you find bugs, please report them. And otherwise, we'll sort of keep moving forward. And I think right now releases are going to be somewhat cut on demand. So the other thing is, if you want a release cut, if there's some bug fixes that you want to see in a release, please poke me or Chris Nova in Slack. I think we may be the only people right now that can actually click the release button in GitHub. So we'll also, as we figure out a proper process for doing releases going forward, we'll probably want to fix that too. Next, we have status of clusterctl documentation with link to a pull request.
I put this in near yours because I thought it was related, but I didn't want to take too much time with it. The thing I started doing from a week ago was creating a Docker image containing cluster control, and the feedback on the PR was that perhaps we should have some documentation for this. I noticed that in the cluster API repo, two of the other primary binaries that are generated, the controller and the API manager or API server, they do not have readmes. So I wondered if there is a different authoritative source for documenting cluster control other than the relatively terse documentation in the README right now. And then secondly, if that README is the authoritative source, do we want to put documentation for the containerized version there? And how do we envision recommending like the primary way to run this? Is it through the binary releases or through the container, or both?
Jessica, I'm going to sort of put you on the spot for at least the first one of those, which is the current state of documentation for clusterctl and where we expect that to be going. So I think that's a good discussion to have.
Yeah. So can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So the current README that's with clusterctl is the only README, and I guess the authoritative source on how to use the cluster ctl binary itself. I guess my comment on the PR was I see an image is being built, there's a clusterctl in it, but I'm not sure what is, I guess, the intention with it. How is the end user supposed to be using this image? I mean, and what requirements are there on using this image? Do I have to set up the machine that this Docker image runs in a particular way for it to work well, et cetera, et cetera? So those sort of pieces of information I think would be helpful for folks who want to use the Docker image, so they know what are the requirements, restrictions, how to use, et cetera. I anticipate people will want to use clusterctl directly, and I will also anticipate some people might want to use it in a Docker image. For example, like the end-to-end tests and test infra that we have in the future would probably benefit from having a Docker container to run clusterctl from and whatnot. Did I answer all the questions, or did I miss something?
I think so. Let me state that to make sure.
Yeah.
So documentation for the container version of cluster control should go in the same README in the command directory. And we want to maintain the other parallel documentation in that same README for how to run things as a binary and not a containerized binary.
Yeah, in terms of where the documentation for the container goes, I don't actually mind whether it's part of the README for the clusterctl binary itself, or whether it's in a separate page that happens to link in one direction or the other. It doesn't matter to me. So feel free to put it as part of the official clusterctl meeting, and feel free to put it in a separate README that sits where the Docker image is. I have no preference.
Do either of you guys have an opinion on what we think would be the recommended way to run clusterctl? Do we think that we'll get to a point where we recommend people running it in a Docker container because it removes dependencies on how the host is configured at some point in the future? I mean, it's great to have the flexibility to run it in lots of different ways, but there's also value in saying, here's the way you should run it, here's the way it's been tested, here's the way that we all run it, just so that, you know, we're sending people down a path that's going to work.
I think that, well, in general, it's if the Docker container contains, you know, things set up in a good way for clusterctl, that would be good for people to use that, because that means we have consistent environments that we're running clusterctl in. The reason why I don't say that we should all use that Docker container is because the image is probably tied to something like Linux or whatnot, and I feel like there may be people who want to run clusterctl in environments other than Linux. And so I don't think it will cover everyone's cases, but I think it would probably be best if everyone in general used it so we're consistent about our environments. That's my 2 cents.
So I agree with that. And I also think that because it's a Golang binary, the dependencies on the host are less of a concern than it would be if it was an arbitrary C program. Even still, I worry about, I wonder what we should promote as the official or recommended way, because that's the documentation we have to put first. We have to make sure we maintain, and I'm not even sure if I really see a strong need to document how a developer might not use the container. Like if you wanted to run this in an environment that wasn't Linux, I would say that's a feature that we should add. Like we need a non-Linux container that we can support. I mean, I guess I'm leery of trying to support things that aren't containerized.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of what I was trying to get to is even if it works in multiple ways, it'd be great if we had one way that we told people to do it, and there are maybe other ways you could do it, but that we don't spend a ton of effort making sure those continue working indefinitely, right? And you know, we have documentation saying this is how you should do it, and yes, you could do it differently. Like right now, the documentation says run the binary, and you could run it in a container, right, if you want to figure out how to do that, but we aren't necessarily going to spend a lot of time making that work. And we could flip it and say, we think you should run it in a container, and if you want to run a bare binary, especially as a developer, you know, maybe we have a README that's sort of deeper in the tree, that's less sort of end user facing, that we document that for developers.
My 2 cents on sort of which to do is, right now, at least looking at the PR, it looks like all that's happening here is the clusterctl binary is in a Docker image. If it had more of the prerequisites set up for clusterctl, I think we should definitely use the container as our standard and our first choice. But if it's just a binary in an image, then I'm a little bit less compelled to make that our first default choice for how to run clusterctl, because then you have to kind of go into the container to run clusterctl. There's an extra layer without a whole ton of benefit, but that's kind of how I see it.
I tend to agree. That's why I didn't want to spend too much time on this. Maybe the action item is I should come back with more detailed documentation, which would have benefit independent of the choice. And then we can revisit if that documentation makes it valuable or enough, then we can make that the recommended way. But right now, I agree that the patch doesn't do, I mean, it literally was a cut and paste of something else. So.
Yeah, I think documentation will be great, because that will sort of elucidate the end user experience of what we think this should look like. And then we can make the patch actually, you know, drive to that end user experience, as opposed to doing it sort of the other way around, where we are creating a change, but we aren't really sure what the value of that change is, right?
Yeah. Like maybe I should take a step back and sort of ask: is the goal of this Docker image to be clusterctl plus all the dependencies like pre-installed or something like that? So all you have to do is, like, all the requirements on the operating system is you're running Linux and you have Docker, and therefore you can run clusterctl, or is this only supposed to be a thin layer with just the cluster binder in it for the future?
I would say it should have all the dependencies. It should make things easier, not harder.
Okay, cool, good. I'm totally for something like that. That would be excellent.
Okay, so I think the action there is to sort of maybe write the docs first almost in terms of here's how we think this should work. And once we agree on that experience, then we'll make the code match. And I think, Jessica, you're sort of implicitly here signed up to be the reviewer of that experience, if that's okay with you.
Sounds good.
All right, I'll put the action in the meeting notes. In the meantime, Martin, do you want to start working on the next agenda item?
Oh yeah, let me just see which one was it, because I had a bunch. Okay. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, even I think it was a month ago, there was discussion about rows in the machine object, in the machine resource. And right now it appears that especially there's a lot of blur between master node and which is actually master and what we define as master. And we had some discussions here internally in SAP and with some other folks. And I mean, there were some talks about even only running the kube aggregator because the Kubernetes is very good. I mean, the Kubernetes API machinery is very good for writing APIs. So there were some talks about even these things. So, and my question is pretty much, do we actually need rows or it's only for kube ADM? Because there are a lot of solutions right now that pretty much run Kubernetes, the control plane inside other Kubernetes as well. So there, in this case, they will only need pretty much nodes. So this was one of my concerns with this regard.
I'm glad you're bringing this up because this was on my list of things to bring up at some point too. I had a talk with Tim Hawken a little while back about our API, and he looked at roles and said, you should take that out. So it's been on my list of sort of trying to figure out how to take it out in a way that's not going to break the code that we have today. And I think one way to do that might be, we've talked a lot about in the past about introducing new fields by putting them in the provider config. And if we see consistency, we can elevate those into the API. I almost wonder if we should just take roles and demote those into the provider config for the places we need them until we can decide if we actually need them in the long term and remove them from the top level API.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, pretty much if you look at the use case about kube aggregator and etcd, in that case, you don't even need the cluster object because there you only specify like the pod names, the pod seeders, the service seeders, and you don't need actually those things for kube aggregator. So yeah, in this case, there is also not need for the cluster object. I mean, only for the version as well.
So I'm curious for you to explain that use case a little bit more. I'm not sure I'm completely understanding what that would look like.
I mean, I had a talk with some guys here, and they were just wondering if they can simply use the API machinery, just like the kube aggregator, to write some APIs.
So would that look like you create a node, it's running a kubelet. How do you run the kube aggregator on that node?
I mean, it's not kube aggregator. It's only etcd plus kube aggregator. That's it. You can run them as a binary. You don't even need kubelets. Well, you can use kubelets if you want to, yeah, to have the Kubernetes experience. But yeah. So I'm not sure if this thing is actually covered by this API or should be covered, in fact.
Yeah, that's what was my next question is the use case of just running an aggregator in etcd even something that sort of falls in the scope of the cluster API, or is that someone who's not actually running a cluster and they just want to run those two binaries for a different reason?
Yeah, I mean, because in some cases they, from what I've heard, they are actually interested, for example, in learning like some combo because they want the the authentication and authorization from the API server, and probably a stripped down version of the API server with only the services and the secrets APIs enabled, and yeah, and probably the controller manager with only like the service controller, service account controller running.
Okay, so it sounds like what they want is basically a Kubernetes control plane, but stripped down.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they want parts of the controller manager, they want parts of the API server, right? So at that point, it is starting to look more like the way that Gartner runs a Kubernetes cluster, but instead of deploy Kubernetes cluster, you'd say deploy this, whatever else you'd want to call it, that's like bare bones Kubernetes-ish control plane.
Yeah.
And you could run that the same way in Gartner that you run Kubernetes clusters.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they want that the API machinery pretty much. So
yeah, interesting. To step back to what we were talking about, and I think agreed on, but I want to get feedback from everybody else on the call. Do people have any sort of strong feelings one way or the other about whether roles should be part of the machine's API, or whether that's something that people are comfortable taking out of the API?
From our side, I would say that sounds fine. We already kind of have instances where we might want to have our own roles, which would not be suitable for the upstream. Moving it into provider config seems like a fine option to me.
Cool. Anybody else?
So I have a question actually. When you think about implementing something like Upgrader on top of Cluster API, Upgrader should work with any provider, right? I think that's the intent, is that independent of provider, Upgrader works. When you're doing an upgrade, whether a node's a master or a node makes a difference. So so you need some way to test whether you're going to perform the upgrade action on the node. So how would you do that? I mean, I think you either have to make it a spec value that you can check, or you have to have the provider give you a function that checks internally, does its own magic, and tells you whether or not to proceed or not.
Interesting. Yeah, there are a couple of places in the GCP code right now I know where we're explicitly checking that role and doing different actions. So we were talking about deleting clusters, and one thing that the GCP code does right now is says if this is a master, don't delete it, right? Because we don't want to accidentally delete the master. And I think what you're bringing up is a similar use case, which is during upgrades, you want to maybe treat that master machine differently than you would treat a worker node. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
That's pretty much what we're doing in the GC machine consider right now. If the machine is master, we will do in place upgrade. So,
right. So
use case covered? Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead, Martin.
Isn't this use case covered by, for example, the taints?
It could be. So, sorry, Margaret.
No, go ahead.
A long time ago, we had a provisioner at Samsung where there were specific node roles, and then we rewrote it to be so that nodes were agnostic in terms of the role, and instead there were certain properties of the node that we could check to determine if the node effectively had that role, even though it was implicit. And what we realized later is that by making the property implicit instead of explicit, it just complicated the logic to determine if an action should be taken or not. Because we couldn't just say, is the node of this type, take the action or not? Instead, we have to say, does it have this taint? And does it have this annotation, but not this annotation? And if so, go ahead. And we found that there were a lot of properties of the nodes that overlapped multiple roles. And so it made the checks more complicated. I think that's fine. We ended up hiding those checks in some other function, but there is there is a reason for certain code to take different actions depending on not just a specific property, one property of a node, but a set of properties that happen to appear at the same time for, I don't know, I'm trying to avoid using the word role because that's what we're talking about. I don't want to bait the question, but that's sort of the thing is like nodes have certain functionality that may not map directly to a single property unless you invent a property.
Yeah, that was actually one of the problems we saw with roles also, which was right now we have a role for master and a role for node, but Martin mentioned other use cases for things that aren't masters or nodes, right? Like you might want to run the aggregator plus etcd. We've also talked about like what if you wanted an etcd cluster that didn't run the full sort of stack of a master as kubeadmin defines it, but you just want to run some etcd nodes, and then you tell kubeadmin I have an external etcd cluster when you spin up. How do you represent those here? Also, with the current two roles we have, there's a table that says you can specify more than one. If you specify this one, you get this behavior. If you specify both, you get this behavior. And that right now sort of small 4-cell table explodes exponentially as you start adding more roles, and you can have a list of roles and all of their overlapping combinations. And I think it sort of devolves into the same thing you were talking about with the implicit roles you had with annotations and taints, where you're going to have to check, am I this role and this role, but not this other role, and then take a different action. And it's going to sort of end up with the same complex logic in the end. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I wonder if we need to attack that problem just differently rather than, using roles or annotations or taints. Like those sort of all are similar ways of solving the problem. It's sort of where you represent it in the API. And maybe we should think about trying to step back and figure out what the problem is we're trying to solve, and if there's a better way to represent it. I don't know the answer to that yet, but it feels like this way of trying to represent those attributes is just maybe doesn't scale very well as you start to have more attributes.
Yeah, and maybe this is an idea I'm throwing out there, but maybe we just need to be more explicit. Like this machine is running the API server, this machine is running the aggregator or the scheduler, and then instead of having kind of something like master represent a collection of roles, a collection of things that are running on the machine, that we have explicitly this is running, this is running, this is running here. And then logic above that can be like, well, if etcd is running here, I want to be more gentle with it or something. But yeah, that's
a good point, because if you had a quote master that wasn't running etcd because you had external etcd, you'd probably feel a lot more comfortable just deleting it and replacing it than if it actually has your state inside of it because it's also running etcd.
Yeah. So maybe
right now you can't tell the difference.
Yeah. So being explicit instead of being kind of one layer above, where master implies etcd, but literally be like, yes, there's etcd here, or no, there isn't. Potentially is an option that we can all consider.
So I guess the first question would be, does anyone object to sort of demoting roles into the provider config? And then if we start to see similarity, or we have solutions like what Jessica mentioned, we can talk about whether we want to promote that back up. Because in the meantime, it would simplify the top level API. And it sounds like for the use case Martin was talking about, the roles don't really make any sense. They kind of probably just be ignoring them anyway. Does that sound like a reasonable path forward as we try to simplify the API for alpha, and we can clutter it back up again later if it's deemed necessary?
Yeah, you can start looking at are roles only used for identifying where I guess to install some of the software, or are they used for anything else?
So they are used for identifying where to install the software, but I think as Feng mentioned, the GCP code right now switches on roles based on how it does upgrades, right? Because the master is a singleton and we don't want it to delete it, it does a different style upgrade for the master than it does for node. And maybe that's something that we should look about changing as well. But right now, that's the way it was implemented to start with.
Isn't the big thing IAM permissions? I'm not saying I agree with the decision. I'm just saying that that is the thing that really differentiates the master role from the node role.
Can you say more about that?
Oh yes, so that the master gets IAM permissions on AWS and GCP that are much higher to access the cloud on which it is running than the node gets, and that is what that role really determines. And the consequence of that is that's why KCM has to run. That's why the system components have to run on the master, because they need that role, and why you don't want to run user workloads on those masters because they have that role.
So the way it's implemented right now for GCP is we're not actually putting those IAM permissions on the VM itself. We're taking a service account and shoving it into the containers that should have those permissions. So instead of having that role scoped to the entire node, where you'd be sort of scared of any workload that runs on the node sort of inherits those permissions. Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we actually take a service account and push it into where it's actually needed.
Actually, I think we do tie service accounts to the VMs.
Oh, bummer. Okay.
Yeah, change one in.
Totally wrong.
We actually in the Gardener do the thing that Robert described. So we actually, the only thing that needs to talk to the API, to the IaaS infrastructure is the controller or the cloud controller manager. So we pretty much add the credentials for the provider there. So in our use case, it's kind of, we don't want to do it.
Maybe the conclusion is that this is actually like provider specific, genuinely provider specific, right? So I think the goal, like the approach where you put it into containers is great if you can figure out rotation, but yeah.
Yeah, the only danger of putting it into the provider config is the fewer things you have at the top level, the harder it is for general tools to be able to use the top level API features to make smart decisions, right? And I think that's what I think is it David or Daniel DeWatt? I think it's David, right?
Sorry, David. Yeah.
David. I think that's what David was trying to say earlier, was if you start hiding some of these things that have to be provider specific, it makes the general tooling harder to write.
I've definitely missed a lot of discussion from earlier on. Is labeling and annotations something that could be used on machines to kind of identify some of the intent where to place particular software? I mean, the whole IAM thing sounds to me fairly provider, I guess, config specific, right? We just go into the generic section of the I guess whatever the configuration is for. But instead of potentially specifying a role as a top level thing, can we not rely on something more, I guess, maybe it's more conventional, I guess, where we'll just say, hey, there's some things that are labeled, and then over time, if we go from one component that's, maybe API to any components, whatever they may be, right? All we're really talking about is controllers just looking at the labels of the machines or labels of something else to identify some of these resources.
You could certainly use labels. I think the tricky bit there would be sort of making standard labels that everybody would have to adhere to if automation was going to rely on those labels to do the right thing. So it'd be both labels, and kinks probably, or potentially annotations, right? So David mentioned that they had used all of those things at Samsung.
Right. I mean, but it sounds like Kubernetes community as a whole does have a pretty good track record of identifying some kind of a common set of labels for things, right? So I imagine that would be too different from the rest of the things.
Yeah, that's true. And we could certainly say that for clusterctl installs, these are the labels we expect to be on different types of machines. I guess the question then is, if we're standardizing that way, how different from actually exposing a notion of a role, or as Jessica mentioned, specific things we expect to be running on those machines is that? Is that just an indirect way of doing that instead of a direct way of doing it?
Well, I guess I could imagine that role is kind of ends up to be, well, I guess the one way I'm thinking about is you could imagine labeling the same machine with multiple things, right? If you want to be installing a bunch of things on the same machine, right? Versus role, to me at least, implies kind of a more singular thing. Maybe that's just me, but that's at least one thing that comes off top of the head to the reason why to go is more kind of a conventional labeling thing versus role.
We actually do. There are some labels which are generally agreed by everyone except for one player in the world, and then the challenge though is taints, right? In that you can't have two. Did I freeze? No, sorry. You can't have two taints if so you can't have a taint for master and for node, and because then all the user workloads would have to tolerate the node taint. But I think we can probably use the existing labels where they make sense and see where they don't make sense. I feel like Robbie has frozen.
I don't think so. I can still hear you. Everybody's still moving.
Oh, sorry. I just froze on my machine. That was very weird.
Okay, it's a little bit more than half past, and I don't want to rat hole on one topic for the whole time, because I think the other topics are probably interesting too. I would say it sounds like we have sort of tentative agreement to demote roles. We probably won't actually do that before next week's meeting, so maybe we'll give people a week to think about that while we prepare PRs to make the change, because it'll be a little bit invasive on the GCP side to read the fields from somewhere different. But I think I would propose that as a reasonable path forward for now, and try to simplify the top-level API surface for Alpha. And so it's like there's some consensus from people with nodding or thumbs up and in chat. So if people have objections, I'll open an issue. Also, if people have other thoughts, they can stick it on the issue. So Martin, your next one is about specifying per machine kubelet and other component configuration.
Oh yeah. So right now it's only possible to specify, for example, where's the dynamic kubelet configuration config map available at, and it's not actually possible to specify like for this kubelet that is running on some GPU nodes, I want to run these experimental APIs or have this flag and etc. So, and it's not only limited to kubelet configuration. You might have use cases in which you want to configure other components like the API server as well. And currently, I don't see this thing in the API.
So the link to the dynamic kubelet config is on a machine, right? So if you have two sets of machines, one which is running your special GPUs, which you want different flags, and one of which is running your standard CPU memory machines, you can take each of those machine sets and point them at a different dynamic kubelet config, which would specify different properties for the kubelet on those machines. Is that kind of what you're looking for, or do you need more configuration?
Or I mean, I'm more into describing those properties. I mean, yeah, those sets of flag or pretty much the kubelet configuration at all. I don't see it in the API anywhere. It's not provider specific because other components, because other cloud providers, it's not so much about the different cloud provider. It's more about the different components that actually run on that machine. And this pretty much ties to the previous discussion about the rows. And for example, in some cases, you might want to upgrade the version of the API server, and then you specify some flags or something like this.
Yeah, so I think we should probably separate the conversation about components running on a machine like an API server, which sort of ties back to roles, with the kubelet. Like, I think the kubelet is something we should definitely make clear and possible how to configure in the machine API, because the kubelet is tightly tied to the machine. And then we want to talk about like the other components we want to run to make a control plane, which formerly was what happened when you specified role of master. That's probably a separate discussion. So I kind of want to tease those apart, and let's start with the kubelet and say, so we want kubelets to have different flags or different behavior in different nodes on the system. How do we do that? Is the API expressive enough today? So I think that's the first thing to talk about.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I think you're saying you don't think the API is expressive enough today, and I want to know why.
I mean, you can put this thing into the cloud config, but it's specific, for example, for GC. But this entire thing applies for everyone, pretty much, for all different providers.
Yeah, I guess I'm not understanding. So the dynamic kubelet config that you can reference to in a machine has, I think, both the provider specific and the provider independent bits in it. And you
but
point each machine at a different kubelet config to get different behavior on each machine.
Yeah, my goal was pretty much to describe, like, for example, I want this machine to have all those flags on the kubelet, and currently, at least with the machine API, I cannot do it directly. I have to first create probably the cloud configuration as a config map, and then just reference it. I'm not sure that this is the use case, but
yeah, it's interesting. I think the way that we were thinking about the kubelet configuration was that the kubelet itself knows how to read the kubelet config, right? That's what Mike Toffin has been working on for a while. It's finally in beta now in 1.11, and that the machines API would basically stitch together the description of the physical machine with the config for that machine by referencing between the two. And so if you're writing a system that uses a machines API, you would have the choice of saying, I want to create this config map and then a machine that uses it. And then you could build interesting tools that know how to create different config maps for different types of machines if you wanted to, like a GPU machine. I don't know how we would represent that in the machines API if we were doing it more directly. Are you saying that we should take the fields we care about in the kubelet and make them like kubelet config fields in the machines API, and then have the controller create the kubelet config from those and then link that to the node object?
I mean, if you look at the versioning, etc., because I don't know, there must be some coordination between both of those things at the end. So I'm not sure where is the correct place to put this coordination and who should actually care about those things. Because, for example, when you upgrade the configuration, some fields might change and etc. So
yes, that's a really good point. So I think we punted on that a little bit by basically saying that you as the person or automation that is creating the machines are responsible for linking them up with the kubelet configuration on those machines, and that's a little bit out of band. We could take the approach that the fields that are important we specify directly in the API, and that the thing that links them together is the machine controller. Like the machine controller could be responsible for creating the dynamic kubelet config and stitching it into the kubelet configuration. That would be interesting. I know that talking to Mike, the kubelet config has something over 100 different fields in it. And I don't know how many of those would be important enough to put as direct fields into our API.
I was more thinking about currently with QPI ADM, for example, you can specify all those different flags, especially for the different components like the API server. But this is related to next talk.
Yeah, no, I think the API server is different than the kubelets. Because with the kubelets, you do have a strong link that there's effectively one kubelet per machine, right? And we have an API that describes a machine. And so configuring that kubelet on that machine, like there is sort of a tight link there. When you say, I declaratively want this machine to be part of my cluster, and you describe the configuration of that machine in terms of its physical properties, and then you also want to describe the configuration of that machine in terms of its sort of kubelet flags, if you will, right, or the kubelet properties. So I definitely see sort of the strong link there in the API, and right now we have a link there but it's sort of the onus is put on the person using the API to leverage that. And maybe that's not sufficient. I don't know if anybody's actually used that part of the API yet, the dynamic kubelet config part of the API. I think it'd be interesting to try and get that working and see which pieces of dynamic kubelet config are actually valuable to set. Like if you are creating machines with GPUs, how much kubelet config is there that you have to change versus a non-GPU machine?
So right now, for example, we're using it as our way to bootstrap like the nodes. Currently, we don't specify explicitly those flags, and we have like one generic for all. But hopefully, in the future, we should be able to do so. And I was hoping to have like one way to express those things for a different set of machines, pretty much.
Yeah, I think that comes back to like which things are you trying to express, right? Because there are like, you know, over 100 knobs for the kubelet that we can specify. Like which ones are you finding in practice you actually need to be changing? And it sounds like so far you have a consistent set and you think there's going to be some divergence, but do we know what the divergence is yet?
Oh, currently not. Yeah, so.
Okay. Yeah, I think there could be an argument made that there should be some explicit kubelet configuration in the machine's API, because we are saying, here's a version of the kubelet that should be running on the machine. Maybe we should also be saying, here's how to configure that kubelet. And like I said, right now we have that via the reference to a dynamic kubelet config. So if that is sufficient, then maybe we leave that. And if it's not sufficient, maybe we replace that with more inline configuration. But I think we need to figure out, we need to try and use what we have now and see if it's too hard to use. And we also need to see which things we think would be important enough to promote to the API to configure on the kubelet. Because I don't want to have to copy every field that's in dynamic kubelet config over, right? That was the reason we put a reference, was with a reference you say the node team and SIG node is responsible for maintaining all the flags. You can use whatever flags you want as long as they have them defined, and we don't have to sort of mirror those or stay up to date, which is a pretty big burden for us to take on, I think.
Yeah, and for example, those flags are not currently exposed as an API resource, so it's kind of hard to get them directly without actually copying the Kubernetes repository. So
yes, that's a good point. Yeah, there are a couple other things like that as well that are hard to do programmatically without copying all the Kubernetes code, which is a pain. So that's a good point. I'll poke Mike about that and see if they have any thoughts about sort of making client tooling.
Actually, at KubeCon, I had a talk with all the API machinery guys, and they were pretty much okay for, I mean, yeah, they were talking, I talked to them about having all those different configurations, and hopefully in the future, for example, for the API server to be like component configuration and have them as a resource, actually. And they will say, oh yeah, it was good, but someone has to do it, so yeah.
Yeah, that's always the hard part. People can agree on good ideas. It's someone actually building them is hard. All right, we have about 15 minutes left, so I think we should move on to, well, I think if you want to choose, should we talk about configuring other components or your last agenda item, because we may not have time for both, which is container runtime?
Let's get the container runtime right now. So currently, for example, with Cryo and some other tools, you can specify, for example, multiple runtimes that you can use. So you can have runc, you can have Kato containers, and then you can gvisor for different workloads. And I've been wondering, should we make, for example, the container runtime a slice or for multiples? So, and for example, where do we put also the configuration for this thing? Because in some cases, you might want to have different configurations for the different runtimes because for example, kubelet will probably move to container runtimes hopefully in the next 1 year and remove the Docker thing.
So I sent this PR that removed the container runtime version from the spec. Do you remember that one? So what's left that where we'd be specifying the container runtime?
Just quick check it because I can see it. Yeah, great.
And again, like, this is a place where there could be some movement in like the provider config section of, like, maybe in the Gardener system, you guys do care about making this a declarative thing, and so you guys stick it in there. And if that's something that we think has broader applicability, we can promote it back up. All right, so we have about 10 minutes left. Martin and I have been having the majority of the conversation, sort of we've been monopolizing. I want to make sure that that other people on the call have a chance to bring up any other issues that they might have. I know they weren't in the agenda, but if there are other things you guys have been thinking about listening to the conversation, or other points you want to bring up, I want to sort of open the floor up to make sure we hear some other voices.
A couple of weeks ago, we talked about possibly adding some network information to machine status. So I put up that issue. There wasn't any feedback, and I was just wondering if it would be worth throwing together a patch for that, just to add basic IP and DNS fields to the top-level machine status.
I can't remember, was it status or was it spec?
I raised status. That was the one that I was after. Someone on the call suggested spec as well. That's not something I strictly need. And unless somebody does, I would propose we wait on that. But yeah, does status sound okay?
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me. I think that there are, like you were describing, environments where you know that you're creating a machine and you know what its IP is going to be before the kubelet comes back and tells you what the IP is, right?
Yeah, for the spec, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's for the status, right? So if you say, give me a machine,
yes,
we can create the machine, like in AWS, and AWS tells us this will be its IP address long before the kubelet actually gets bootstrapped and registers, and you can follow the reference to the node that actually tells you what the node is reporting as its IP address.
Yeah, exactly.
Is there already facilities to find out which IP address is the IP address that kubelet should be reporting? As in, like, if, like, for example, AWS CNI, I believe, just adds more IP addresses and whatnot, right?
My thought was actually to just do what we do on the node, which is it's kind of non-specific. As far as I know, I'm not sure exactly how they calculate which IP to put in there, but you can put in as many as you want of various types. So it would kind of be up to the provider to interpret it how you need to if you're going to use that information.
That makes sense. Yeah, I was worried about when there's multiple in IPv6 and whatnot.
Yeah. Okay, if that's all right, I'll put up a PR and see how that goes.
Yeah, that sounds great. Looking forward to a PR. Thanks, Devin.
If no one else has any other topics, I did have one question. Was there any thoughts more about how to integrate better with the IAAS control planes? I know some of the orchestration APIs are, well, most of our current orchestration APIs, I think, are focused around machines. Is there any thoughts about how to, I guess, state that, for example, GCP or AWS or whoever manages the control plane, and then kind of a point back to it?
All right, I'm trying to parse what you're saying. So you're basically saying, like, on the GCP case, I want a GKE cluster, but I want to use the machines API to manage the machines inside of my GKE cluster. Is that what you're saying?
Yep. But not the control plane.
So the control plane would still be managed by GKE, but the machine controller and the machines API would be managed by the user of GKE?
Yep.
Or AWS if you're using AWS. Okay.
Right.
So I think that would work as long as the hosted service allows you to register an extension API server. You could register an extension API server, and then you could use the API aggregation in the hosted control plane to get to the resources that are in your extension API server. So you'd run your own extension API server, you'd run your own controller, right, your own machine controller that would act upon those resources, and then it should work. It's sort of an interesting deployment model because you have, in a lot of cases, I think we're thinking about like the machine controller and the API server for the cluster API to sort of be part of the control plane for Kubernetes, right? Like it's sort of an extension of the control plane. And this is true of any time you run an extension API server, is where does that run and who manages it and how does it sort of hook into your cluster? Is it part of the cluster control plane sort of in a logical sense? Or is it something that's running inside the cluster? Because at that point, you're going to have the hosted control plane from the cloud provider and the machine controller both having very sort of high level credentials to act upon your cloud resources, right? They're both going to have credentials. The hosted one will have credentials to create load balancers, for instance, with the ingress controller, and the machine controller will have credentials to create and delete VMs. And the cluster autoscaler will also have credentials to create and delete VMs. And so, I think in a lot of cases, like as Justin was saying before, people are sort of trying to separate roles in terms of who has privilege and who has permission, and run the user workloads on machines that have sort of lower privilege than what the control plane has. And so this would require you to be running those pods or potentially those machines with a higher privilege level than maybe the rest of your cluster. So I think it's certainly possible, but I think you have to think about some of the implications from a security point of view of what that means to have part of your control plane running alongside the rest of your user workloads, and decide if that's something you're comfortable with.
Right. Yeah. I guess that the interesting bit here is, some of the tooling that, from a CLI perspective, for example, how would that integrate with kind of a setup like this, right? If that tooling always assumes that it is responsible for, let's say, upgrading a cluster, right, then there's potentially less flexibility there in supporting case like that.
Yeah, so I think in that case, you'd probably end up with the machines API would make sense for that cluster, but not the sort of cluster API that declaratively specifies a control plane. You'd still have to talk to the cloud provider to upgrade your control plane version.
Right. I'll think more about it.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and if that's something, you can also sort of write up an issue or a short doc if you want to sort of describe what you think that would look like. That might be an easier forum for people to comment on it as well.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. All right, we have about 2 minutes left. Are there any other things people want to bring up before we call it for this week?
Hi, for someone new here, so I want to understand how to get started or try it out what cluster API already built. I just read the README file in the GitHub. I don't necessarily provide a lot of information on how to try it out.
Jessica, do you want to take that one?
Sorry, it was a bit quiet. I couldn't quite hear what was being asked.
So the question is for someone like me, new here, I want to try it out what cluster API already built. Just looking for some document.
Sure. I can point you to the clusterctl, which will be the CLI for setting up clusters with a cluster API stack, and some examples. Yeah, I'll link somewhere, maybe in the notes.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Is it possible to have like a floating Bosh IO?
Is someone asking a question? It's very quiet if you are. It's possible that's also just background noise. All right, we're pretty much out of time, so we will say farewell for this week. Thank you everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you all again next week. Have a good week.